We are engaged in a series of interviews, Mr. Smith, of those people that we believe have made a substantial difference in not only the profession of law, but in society. And you've been chosen as one of those people by the Standing Committee on Professionalism of the Florida Bar. So what I'd like to do is just ask you a few questions and get your thoughts so we can all learn a little bit from you. Could you give me a rough idea of your, an oral history from high school, let's say, as to where you went to school and the firms or the positions you've held?
I got out of high school in Arcadia, Florida, DeSoto County High School, a small town, a small county, in 1934 when I was 16 years old. My graduating class had about 30 people in it, and the whole high school probably had less than 150, maybe 160. I didn't go to school that first year. I worked. It was in the middle of the Depression, and it wasn't quite right for my family for me to go to school that first year. I did go to the University of Florida in September of 1935, and I entered the school. I stayed a year and a half the first time. I then would drop out of school for a semester or so, work in various places, and come back to school. And I eventually, I did that 3 different times. I didn't finish at the University of Florida. I had at least thought a little bit about law, but never did get through with that. I went into World War II. I'm not absolutely certain of the date, but I joined the National Guard the week they were mobilized, and I think they were mobilized November the 25th, 1940. And we stayed in Arcadia for several weeks, but then we went to Camp Blanding, which was being built up in North Florida, and we stayed there basically, I'll say we went there by January, and we stayed there basically a year. I was there, for example, doing Pearl Harbor. And right after Pearl Harbor, they moved me up the coast of North Carolina, and I stayed up there about 60 days, came back to Camp Blanding as people rotated, and somewhere like the 1st of March, I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where I was admitted to Officers Candidate School. That was a 90-day course, and so somewhere around the 1st of July, I got out of there and went home and stayed for 30-day leave, as I remember it, and then went to Fort Custer, Michigan, which was at Battle Creek, for the formation of a new infantry division. They just had a few experienced people there, and they were bringing in everybody, filling in the slots. I went up there as a second lieutenant because I'd been in the service by then for a pretty good while. I've been in the National Guard. I was promoted, and they needed them, to first lieutenant about 30 days after I got there because they wanted some first lieutenants as distinguished. They had a few captains, no first lieutenants, not many officers of any kind, and they were getting ready to bring in draftees to train. We stayed at Fort Custer, as I remember it, about 3 to 4 months, and then we went to Camp Phillips, Kansas. We got there probably by December the 1st of 1942, and 41, no, 42. And we stayed there for most of a year. Somewhere maybe in October of 43, we went on maneuvers to Tennessee. We got on the maneuvers, and when we got through, we moved to Grenada, Mississippi, to Camp McLean. I stayed at Camp McLean then I'd say 5 or 6 months. I got married while I was there. I went home on a 5-day leave to Arcadia, Florida, my hometown. I married my longtime friend, sweetheart, Vivian Parker. We got married January the 29th, 1943, and I went back to Camp McLean in Oxford. We lived there for quite a while. Eventually, if my dates are right, I'm not absolutely sure, my unit was picked to go overseas, and we went overseas to England somewhere around April the 1st, 1944. We were overseas in England at VE Day, but we didn't go in for about 40 or 50 days before we went in. We eventually went into Omaha Beach, and then we went over into Brittany and helped a little bit around Cherbourg and Brest, but we were soon assigned to a seaport, Lorient, where the Germans had not left. They had a submarine base, and we surrounded it, and we stayed there like 5 months, I'll say. There were either 2 or 3 of those seaports that German submarine bases continued in, and while maybe they could have been eliminated, they weren't worth the cost. You just bracketed them in. Eventually, we were moved over to the Third Army of General Patton on the front that was along the border of France, as it near Switzerland, just north of Switzerland. But of course, Germany was across the Rhine River, and we were in the Third Army, and then we were moved up. Stretched out more and more as they were fighting more to the north, and all of a sudden they had the Battle of the Bulge. We were the Northern Division in the Third Army. When the Battle of the Bulge came, immediately they ordered Patton to move his army up to help them, and we kept moving and moving, just stretching out our lines, but all of the divisions south of us went around the back of us and went up north to start fighting. And we became ultimately the Southern Division by not moving at all, but by stretching out and defending. We were new and hadn't had much battle experience, and one reason they were sending more experienced troops around us. Eventually, however, we too got into the Battle of the Bulge near the end, and we got up into Luxembourg and helped close it out, and we then were sent over to the Saar Valley at Saarburg, and we stayed there for, I'll say, 3 months or so. We finally, we were in a siege of a town across the river. Eventually we broke through, and they got a a bridge open across the Rhine, and we were about 90 miles away from the Rhine. We went up to there and fought and had people killed. Saw jets for the first time somewhere around March the 1st, I'd guess. I don't know my dates anymore. 1945, we got to the Rhine, maybe even in February. They pulled us out and then sent us around and put us up in the First Army. We went up and fought across at Dusseldorf, which was a city up north of Cologne, across the river, and we got across the river, and as we did get across it after being on the other side about 2 weeks, well, VE Day came, which, if I remember, was May the 8th, 1945, and I, as a captain and a battery commander, was put in charge of a little Kreis, which is a county government that had about something like 200,000 people in it. I forget the name of it, and they had German officials. We left them somewhat with restrictions and control, but I was in charge of them. Obviously, there were all kinds of stair steps above me in all the other areas, but locally, and I stayed there only about 40 days, and then we went to, there was still some, even though VE Day, there was still some trouble in fighting, and we went over towards Munich and ultimately into Czechoslovakia to help stabilize things, and I spent the last 90 days that I was in Europe in World War II. I started home pretty early because I'd been in a long time, and I believe that I got back to the States somewhere as early as September the 10th or 1st or somewhere in there. I met my wife, and we went, I was discharged at Camp Blanding where I'd been in. We went to Cuba and stayed 2 weeks back in the days when Havana was a great place to have fun and to do things. And we stayed there, and we went back to Arcadia, my hometown, and her hometown, where she'd been living all the time. And I'd guess that was the middle of November when we got back. I decided then, right away, that I knew they had the GI Bill, and it had already been passed, and I decided to go to the University of Florida and to complete my work and become a lawyer. I went to the University of Florida somewhere before the semester started, but I had to get a house and live, and I was staying with my mother, and so I went up there like 10 days before Christmas, got a house. My mother came up there for Christmas on the train. My wife and I stayed there, and I started to school somewhere, I don't know the exact time, but it seems to me very early in January. I needed one more semester to finish my undergraduate work, and I got it first. I entered law school in June of 1946, and I stayed straight through for 2 years. I enjoyed law school. I did well, and I graduated in June of 1948 and went to Arcadia, Florida. In those days, most often people didn't get jobs. They opened their own offices somewhere, and sometimes if it was in Florida, most often it was in small towns. I had thought when I was in law school that I was going 2 towns that I looked at that were not big were Sarasota in Vero Beach, but eventually I got an offer for almost the first time anybody had ever been hired, and went back to my hometown of Arcadia. There were 11 lawyers there. I was the 12th one. And I stayed in Arcadia for 25 months, perhaps, and practiced law. I was very involved. I got involved. I was president-elect of the Circuit Bar Association when I left, so it was a mobile and turbulent time as people were coming back. I got an offer from a person that I had known. I'd been active at the law school in the University of Florida, and a great lawyer named William A. McRae Jr., Bill McRae. He later became judge and chief judge of the United States District Court for the Middle District of Florida. He was originally in the Southern District before there was a Middle District. And somewhere around June the 1st, 2 years after I got out of law school, he called me and offered me a job in Bartow, which was another small town 50 miles north, with a law firm called at that time Holland, Beavis, and McRae. The Holland was a former governor and then United States Senator Spessard Holland. The Beavis was an old country lawyer who did real estate work and was a wonderful, nice person, but he wasn't much of a lawyer. And Bill McRae, who turned out ultimately to be my best friend and perhaps mentor. He was 9 years older than me. He had been an All-American football player at the University of Florida. He had been a Rhodes Scholar. He had, during the war, been personal aide to General Hap Arnold of the United States Army Air Force. And he had, as a special emissary, had been a military aide, but had participated and served in San Francisco when the United Nations was created. He came back and he joined the firm for the first time. So he had been there himself only about 2 years when I got there. Maybe he'd been there 3 years. Yeah, he had been 3.5 years, because it was 1950 when I got there. But he stayed with me, and I practiced with him for 11 years, and he was significant to me.
That's an amazing story. I've been mesmerized listening to you. It's very true. You have held a number of important positions with different bar organizations. Can you go through that with me a little bit?
Well, the Florida Bar was created in 1949 as an integrated bar. Before that, there was a Florida State Bar Association. It was voluntary. When I joined the Florida Bar, however, it was integrated, all lawyers in Florida. There were only 1,800 lawyers in Florida in 1948, as it did. Bill McRae, my partner that I talked about, had been instrumental in the creation of that bar, and he was elected as the third president of it. There's a new president every year. However, it sounds funny with all of his background and interest. I was very instrumental in him getting elected. One, he was a modest man, and he didn't like to campaign or proclaim his virtues too much. And two, the state had been so small and the number of lawyers so small. As I told you, when I became a lawyer, there were only 1,700 to 1,800 lawyers in the state, that I knew a hell of a lot more people than we did. The classes at the University of Florida had been like 60 to 80 before World War II, when I went there at 600 after the war, when people came back in my class. And I'd been very active in my class. I was president of the John Marshall Bar Association. I was magister of the Phi Delta Phi legal fraternity, and I knew people all over the state, so I went and helped him get elected and worked at it as hard as he did, perhaps, and it got me involved in the bar right away. I had been elected but never served to head the 12th Circuit Bar Association, which at that time went from Collier County and Naples all the way up through Bradenton and looped over and included Arcadia, where I lived, and Moore Haven and LaBelle and little counties, Fort Myers, Sarasota, Punta Gorda. And I'd known those when I went up to Polk County and Bartow. I started working real hard at the law, started right away thinking about the law firm and what it could do, started building the law firm, and envisioned to a substantial degree some of what it's become. It's become more, of course, than we thought, but it's along the lines of. And I got active again in the bar. I had the first three people, young people we hired, were all outstanding #1 students at the University of Florida. They've all done well. Their names were Bill Henry, who was later president of the Florida Bar, Henry Kittleson, who's the smartest and best lawyer I know, and is general counsel now to our law firm, Holland and Knight, and Stephen Grimes, who's the immediate past Chief Justice of Florida. The three of them and I used to most every Saturday night drink beer and dream about what we were going to do in the future and how the law firm was going to turn out. We decided right away that the future of the law firm was different from what we were doing, and that different from what most lawyers, even in the largest cities in Florida, were doing. They were all general practitioners in those days in very small firms. The largest firm in the state would have less than 20, 16, 18, and everybody was a general practitioner. Most firms were 2 and 3 people if they were there, and they both practiced, everybody in the firm practiced the same kind of law. We decided that we were going to specialize, and that was the way it was going, and we followed it, and it worked out really well. I got to get involved again in the bar. I became president of the 10th Circuit Bar, which is Polk, Hardy, and Highlands County in 1955. I'd gone up there in 1950. In 1970, in a contested race, I was elected to the, maybe it was 58, I don't remember, to the Board of Governors of the Florida Bar, and I served on it. I liked the bar very much, and decided that I liked it very much. Everybody worked very hard. We spent a great amount of our time on discipline and hearing cases and deciding and doing. We traveled, and I got to know, I already knew lawyers all over the state because of the influx of people that come back from World War II and had gone to school, and I got to know lawyers everywhere. And I served as president of the Florida Bar. I could have served earlier, but I had a friend who wanted to serve, and I knew I was doing really well by then. I knew I could be elected almost, and so I told him to go ahead. And I helped him. He had an opponent against him. But I served as president in 1964, 1965. The several accomplishments that about the bar that I've always been very proud of. One of them is that while no person can take as much credit as I might give myself, I was very involved, and perhaps the leader at the minimum, of creating the Florida Bar headquarters, a building that we have up there that's nice, and we had a very small office that we were renting that wasn't very good. And I did it by recognizing at that time the bar had gotten much bigger. We had somewhere around 8,000 lawyers by then. And in 1964. And we, the minimum we did, I concluded and convinced the Board of Governors to adopt, requiring a contribution from all lawyers on a voluntary basis of $500, and the difference was I wouldn't take less than $500, nor would I take more than $500. The bar was ruled under the Constitution by the Supreme Court, and it was very interesting. After I made that rule, the Supreme Court had 7 people on it, and 6 of them sent over checks of less than $500, and the question was what to do. I took the checks back over and left them. They were absolutely furious, but 3 of them, all of them were casual friends, at least of mine, and some of them were very good friends. 3 of them the next day sent back their check for $500, and ultimately all 7 of them did. But the Chief Justice, who was a magnificent Chief Justice named Harris Drew, he had helped me so much in so way, but he felt very strong about this. He felt that that was an arrogant SOB, that I shouldn't have treated everybody that way. And he wouldn't give his $500. About 19 months later, as I recall it, we'd raised all the money, and we had the building underway, and we were putting a plaque up with all the names of who had given. And I went over to see him and told him that was the last day his name could go on the plaque, that I thought that he was a great man and a great justice. I understood the principles which he was following. It wasn't money, but I thought everybody else has disagreed with you. We've done it, and you ought to do it. And he did it. So ultimately, they all got their name on the plaque. The main issues that I had to deal with that year, that besides the routine and the discipline and the building, were rules. We didn't have rules in any court. The only rules that we had were the Florida Rules of Civil Procedure that were somewhat based upon the federal rules of civil procedure. We did not have any rules for appellate. We didn't have any rules for juvenile courts, for small claim courts, for criminal courts at all. And so I got rules for all of the courts adopted and passed during that year, which was significant. The next thing that happened in my career in the bar is, during that year as president of the bar, I had to go to the American Bar Association representing the Florida Bar. I had been to the American Bar Association once before, and I decided I didn't like it. I decided that most of the people that went to the American Bar Association were not as good as the people that I was working with in the Florida Bar, that they seemed to me to be extremely interested in money and seeking clients, and that they went because they were making contacts with lawyers all around the country who were going to send them business. And it just seemed to me that they weren't motivated like those colleagues of mine who would sit for hours and hours and even days and days trying to resolve disciplinary cases or trying to improve the rules. And I said, I'm not going to have anything to do with the ABA. The same year that I was president of the Florida Bar, Lewis Powell later a justice of the Supreme Court, was president of the American Bar Association. He came down to visit us, and they also had the American Bar Association convention on Miami Beach in 1965. And we became very good friends, and he decided to change me and to induce me into liking the ABA. And he put me on a committee that was a wonderful committee and has meant more to me than most anything like that would be, in that they helped me start being interested in things that I hadn't been interested. The name of the law firm, of the committee, was the American Bar Association Special Committee on Availability of Legal Services. And the 7 of us on that committee, who turned out, the 6 other ones turned out to be very unique people to me, were to try to devise ways and means to make legal services available to those Americans who couldn't get them. Obviously, legal aid had already been invented, but it touched only a bit of the very poor. And there were all kinds of other people, middle-class people, that could not afford legal services when they need them. And we re-studied the legal profession, and we looked at things that for 3 years we used to meet about 20 times a year in Chicago on weekends for 2 nights and 3 days. We'd go up there. Friday and Saturday night. We'd go up, start about noon on Friday and end about noon on Sunday. And we met and met and met. We considered things like specialization. We considered things like group legal services and insurance, legal insurance. We considered things like ombudsman. We especially considered things like legal aid in all of its aspects, pro bono, mandatory pro bono. We chatted and talked about all of those things at lawyer referral services, advertising, and what that would do. We spent a tremendous amount of time, and so much of that was adopted in part. And for example, in that committee, I think the first real discussion of federal funding of legal services, such as the Legal Service Corporation, and other things, was started. Many of the things, specialization was started. Later, they created a special committee on specialization, and I became the chairman of it. But the people on there were wonderful, all around the United States. And they impacted me. They still are great and dear friends of mine. We did that for 3 years, and I fell in love with the American Bar Association. And so very quickly, I began to rise in the American Bar Association.
And what was your year in the American Bar Association?
It was Watergate year, 1973, 74. I decided I decided 3 years after I started this to run for president of the American Bar Association. That was never done. Most people, like you mentioned, you talked to Reese Smith. He had the ambition forever, and he had been a wonderful worker who had really achieved a great deal and plowed through things, but he had been working, all the time I'd worked in the Florida bar, he had worked in the ABA, and most of them worked there for years and years, and after they had worked in it 30 years or so, they had run for president. I started to run for president 3 years after I got there, and 5 years after I got there, I knew I was going to be elected, and was elected in the 6th year after I was there. Part of it, Lewis liked me and was helping me, but a lot of other things about it that got involved. I had my background and my program came out of that great committee I'd served on, but in addition to that, I had served, I think, in a significant, perhaps revolutionary way as president of the National Conference of Bar Presidents, an organization there made up of state and local bar presidents, and I had got involved with the program of that and the program doing work on it. And I became president of it about 1969 or 70. And I'd also run for what we call state delegate, which is the senior member from Florida. I had run against two former presidents who had been president of the Florida Bar before I did, one from Orlando and one from Miami. Both of them felt sure they were going to win, but they didn't. One of them had written nominations. He had been to see so many of over 5,000 people when, as I told you, there were probably 12,000 people in the bar by then. That was in 1970. And I won 60% of the vote against both of them in the first election. It was all members of the ABA from Florida can vote. And perhaps the reason I didn't mention, I'll go back, a very other significant part of my life. When I quit being president of the Florida Bar, I ran my law firm all the time I was gone. I became managing partner, or what something, we didn't call it exactly that, but I became head of our law firm in 1957. And at that time we had 7 lawyers. And I mentioned them all.
How many do you have today, approximately?
There's approximately 550 lawyers and maybe 12 or 1,300 people overall.
Mr. Smith, let me ask you this. I've listened.
I want to make a point.
Oh, yes, please.
But as I went out of the Florida Bar, the governor, I had as a Florida Bar program a desire to revise the Florida Constitution, which was malapportioned and which was archaic in many ways. And we had decided to do it by creating a constitutional revision commission that would make recommendations to modify the Constitution in whole or in part to the legislature. It would be funded and paid by the state, and it provided somewhat like our present Constitution does, different ways that they're appointed. The governor of Florida asked me after I went out, for no special reason except he had watched me as president of the bar and knew whether I wanted to be on that Constitutional Revision Commission. And being funny or arrogant or something, I said no. However, I would consider being chairman. And he said he already had a chairman. And I said, well, I don't want to serve then. About 3 weeks later, he had thought about it some more, and he came back and asked me to serve as chairman of the Constitutional Revision Commission. And so, in a general sort of way, I took that on, and for 15 months, I basically quit practicing law. I moved to Tallahassee, and we did draft the proposal, got it through the legislature, and ultimately in 1968 through the people, the present Constitution of Florida. I stayed in Tallahassee 15 months doing that and working at it, though obviously I came home some to see things, and I always kept running my firm. I didn't want anybody else to control the money. And so I did that.
Let me ask you this. In listening to your story here, can you tell me what your basic philosophy of life is? What motivates you?
Well, in the country words of Arcadia, if I see something not working, I want to make it work. If it's broke, I want to fix it. I'm always tinkering. I'm tinkering with the law. I'm tinkering with my law firm. I'm tinkering with things to try to make it better. I believe that lawyers are very wonderful people on balance. There's some assholes,
Right.
but on balance, I like them a great deal. Most lawyers recognize that they have an obligation that's unique and different from most, but not all other people, that they are granted special privileges to practice law, that they are given a monopoly by the state that inhibits the development of certain skills in other people, since they have the monopoly, and that if their skills are not made available to people who cannot otherwise get them, those people won't ever get those skills. That's why we have pro bono services. That's why we have legal aid, because only lawyers can do those things for some people if they're to get fair treatment. And I believed very strongly in all of those kind of things.
Do you have you seen a change in the profession over the last 50 years that has been good or bad or indifferent? Have you seen a change in the way lawyers treat each other?
Certainly not all the changes are good. I was a leader in Florida in what I'll call law office economics and putting in the billable hour. I now deplore the billable hour.
Why?
I believe that the public doesn't like it because they believe that lawyers abuse the billable hour, that they spend time training people with the billable hour, that they spend more time on it than they would otherwise, that they don't look at the value of the service as such, but are trying to say, well, a billable hour makes me make this minimum compensation I want, and I'm just going to charge it whether it's good or bad, and that they should have more value services, I think, than just billable hours. I think that lawyers, including me, have done very well economically, and during my lifetime, they have been probably economically the most successful of professionals. When I was young, doctors were far, far more successful, many times more successful than lawyers. Now I believe that overall lawyers are more successful than doctors. Part of it is the changes in the system that grew out of it. That's why there's so many lawyers now. And while I don't really believe that I'm in favor of stopping growth in the legal profession or anything of the sort, I do think that it's reasonable for society as a whole, for government, for people to decide, even though more legal services might be desirable for some people and even essential, there has to be some limit on how much you can render any service, and I'm not sure we need as many lawyers even as we have. I certainly believe that there needs to be a more equitable division of legal services. I don't know exactly how in a free society in which we have a capitalistic society, exactly how you get people to give up what I'll call paying services to do non-paying services more than they do. I've always believed, and we have in our law firm, and I've always had since I started running it long ago, the absolute right of all lawyers, from the beginner to the old and ancient, to give up to 10% of their time in pro bono services that they choose to do without having any penalty on their compensation. If somebody else doesn't give the 10% and you do, you still ought to make for the 90% that you work the same that he does for the 100% under our rules. And generally our firm has always responded more than a lot of firms in doing pro bono work because of that. Many other firms have rules not dissimilar from that. I think those are very good.
Do you think there needs to be an adjustment in the way law schools operate from how they've operated in the past to meet the new challenges?
Well, I'm not sure I know all about law schools now. I will say that I don't believe they need any more law schools than we have, that the law schools can turn out a lot of lawyers now, that I personally believe that law schools do a good job, but they do a good job more by the way things were when I have been in my prime as a lawyer than they do as of now or in the future, in that it seems to me that what law schools do is very preliminary to other training that a lawyer has to get. And the training that a lawyer has to get, almost I would require that everybody have a mentor, a guider, a teacher, an experienced person that they work with. Law firms, big law firms or small law firms, do that. Now, the problem is that many clients feel that those law firms charge them billable hours and other things while they're actually training lawyers, and that they shouldn't do that, that should come out of. And they feel like, and there's some truth to it, unless senior lawyers can charge for that time, they won't give it to those people otherwise. That's too bad. But so they believe, therefore, that you should get more practical training, more actual experience in drafting and trying and analyzing and advising people in law school, because they don't believe that the clients should have to pay for it outside. Well, that's all hard, and I don't know exactly the answer, but I do believe that the best lawyers that I've ever known were young lawyers who followed the regimen that we have long had in law schools of studying cases and working with wonderful professors without getting too practical, and then come out and get a mentor. That mentor can be one lawyer with whom you practiced, or he can be several lawyers in a large law firm. But the firm itself has to have a commitment to training that lawyer and making that lawyer into the right kind of person with the skills that they need in order to practice law. So I'm not, I guess the question was, what do I think about changing the law school curriculum now? I'm not very much in favor of changing it. I'm more in favor of having some kind of organized ritual where law school graduates worked in the profession with an experienced person, somewhat like under the old system doctors did as interns.
Let me ask you, segue into something else now. Let's talk about the judges and judgeships election, merit selection, merit retention. What is your philosophy or view on the judiciary today?
Well, it's big, and when I was young, and I told you when I joined the Florida Bar, 1,800 lawyers, there weren't many judges either. When there are not many judges, they all were icons. They were all idols. You look up at them. If there's one federal judge in all of southeast Florida, as there was in those days, he is somebody. Now, what do we have? 20 or 25.
We have over 100 state court judges just in Dade County.
Yeah, I know it.
Yeah.
And there's a difference. Well, there were like 3 to 5 state court judges in Dade County in those years, as I remember it. They started immediately growing in the 40s and 50s, but they were still very much in my county of Polk and 2 other counties. We had 2 judges, 2 circuit judges, and they were very special people. I think the judges today are really as good as those judges were, but they're not looked up to the bar and all, and because they're not looked up by the bar, I think the fact that the bar idolized them, it would convey to them that they were very special people and they therefore had special obligation to measure up. And I doubt that they feel that same way now that they did then. But I certainly think that many things have improved a great deal. One, I very much oppose election of judges in any way, at any place, at any time. I think it's an awful way to do. I'm not sure, as much as I was when I fought for it for years, that I favor merit retention elections and other things. I might now go more and more to the federal system of lifetime appointments or something else, but I don't believe we should have elections.
Do you believe that there's been a politicalization of the judiciary as it's moved on, that judges today have become more politicians, or are they still, do you still believe that they are judges in the true sense?
Well, certainly the Peter Fays and Bill Hoover's that you've just been talking to would have been among the greatest of judges always in my time. But I think that that federal judges nowadays, as distinguished from state court judges, are perhaps not quite as good as they were in my day, simply because they're not revered quite as much. There's so many of them that even experienced and good lawyers won't know all of them or know them well. And they don't know enough, so that the judge is not always trying to maintain his image, maintain the evaluation that he knows people have that look up to him. Insofar as state court judges are concerned, there's so many of them that very few of them have exceptional reputations. I'll say the 100 that are in Dade County, there's probably less than 10 that 10% of the lawyers will say they are magnificent, great judges. And part of that grows out of the fact that there's so many of them. The second thing it grows out of is that they have to campaign, and they campaign contributions, seeking help when the average citizen doesn't care. It leaves it primarily to the bar to be a supporter. And while other people get to vote for judges, nobody supports judges but lawyers. That denigrates the system, denigrates the profession, and I think we ought to get rid of it.
If I've asked everyone I've interviewed this question, and to some extent it's a touchy-feel good question, but let me ask you this. If I were to give you a magic wand and say you could use that in any way to fix any part of this profession that you thought needed the most fixing, is there something you would do in particular?
I've tried to wave that magic wand a lot of times, and I am old enough now to know that there's probably not any one thing, but I would, if I had the opportunity, I'd look for it and try to do something with it. What I think that if I had any one thing that I would do with the profession that is not done now, I would try to get everybody to decide as much as they could that there should be a limit on what they would make. And that while I might want the limit to be high, I like new cars, I like my children to go to college, I like my wife to have a fine home, I like all of those things. I think that I see many fine lawyers who are really good people who now make more money than they ever dreamed of, but they dream of more. And that bothers me a little bit. I think that we'd do better if there were restrictions on how much lawyers could make.
One question that I would like to ask you is this. If you had a message or a statement that you'd like to pass on to new lawyers, is there any one thing or a few thoughts that you have that you'd like to share with them and us?
Well, that's a hard question. I'll answer it this way. I think the law uniquely is a place where you should pick somebody to emulate. You should pick mentors. I have had a policy for many years of having one person every year that works with me, sometimes for 2 years, somewhat like judges work law clerks. But I think that any lawyer should have a mentor. Now, the mentor, you should not decide, I'm going to be exactly like that mentor. Everything that mentor does is right. What you should do is to say, this is a unique person, and I want to understand why he or she does what they do. I want to look at it and decide. I'll make up my own mind. I may do different from them, but I want to learn from watching them and their thought process and why they do it. Because if you take, in a law firm like my law firm, of 550 lawyers, there's certainly 25 in here that would be great role models for anybody. If you watch them, you don't have to agree with them in any way, but you learn something by deciding that you wouldn't do it that way. I'd do it another way. But you have to associate yourself so much that you can get the thought process of that person and see what they were faced with, know the facts, and work with them. So it's not just a mentor to teach you to do like they do. It's a mentor that you can use to evaluate the profession and evaluate what makes a great lawyer. Recognize that this particular person who's been very successful will be right most of the time, but that occasionally they may not be, and it'll help you if you just have somebody to take as a role model most of the time.
Mr. Smith, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with all of us, and happy holidays.
Happy holiday.